The eviction notice was taped to my front door on a Wednesday morning in October. I found it at 7:15 when I stepped out to get the newspaper my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, left on the landing for me every morning because she said young women who lived alone should stay informed about the world. I almost missed it. The notice was printed on plain white paper in small font and folded once and taped at eye level, where someone had calculated it would be seen but not immediately obvious from the street. I unfolded it. I read it standing in the doorway of my apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio, in my work clothes with my coffee still in my hand. The notice cited non-payment of rent. I had not missed a single rent payment in 19 months. I stood there for a moment, reading the document a second time to make sure I was understanding it correctly. The language was formal, the font was small, and the legal terminology was dense in the way documents are dense when someone wants them to feel more authoritative than they are. But the core claim was clear. Non-payment. 3 months of it, according to the notice. A demand to vacate within 30 days. 3 months of non-payment had not occurred. I had the bank statements to prove it. I also had something else. I went back inside. I set my coffee on the kitchen counter. I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator where I kept important documents in a simple manila folder system. My mother had taught me when I first moved into my own place at 22. Pay stubs in one folder. Lease documents in another. Receipts and correspondence in a third. I pulled out the correspondence folder. Then I opened my phone and went to the voice recorder app. 6 months of recordings. Every conversation with my landlord, Gerald Marsh, that had taken place in person or by phone since the previous April. 41 separate recordings. Clearly labeled by date. Backed up to cloud storage the same evening each recording was made. I sat down at my kitchen table. I was 27 years old, and my landlord was trying to evict me with a false claim, and he had no idea what I had been quietly doing for 6 months. I called my attorney. My name is Priya Mehta, and I am 27 years old. I grew up in a family that treated documentation the way other families treated prayer. Consistent. Faithful. Assumed to be protective, even when protection was not yet needed. My father was an accountant. My mother was a paralegal for 20 years before she became a legal aid coordinator. Between them, they had produced in me a reflexive relationship with paperwork that my college roommates found mildly alarming, and that had served me well in every adult situation I had encountered so far. I had moved to Cincinnati 3 years earlier for a position as a project coordinator at a healthcare nonprofit. The work suited me. I was organized and patient and genuinely interested in the problems we were trying to solve, and the city was manageable and affordable and had a neighborhood I liked in a way that made getting up in the morning feel straightforward rather than effortful. I had found the apartment on Clement Street through a listing service 18 months before the eviction notice appeared on my door. Second floor of a 3-story building, 1 bedroom. Good light. A kitchen large enough to actually cook in, which mattered to me. The building was older but maintained adequately, and the rent was reasonable for the neighborhood. Gerald Marsh owned the building. He was 58 years old and managed his properties himself rather than through a management company, which meant that every interaction about the building went through him directly. Maintenance requests. Lease renewals. Questions about the parking situation. Gerald handled all of it personally. In the beginning, this had seemed like an advantage. Direct communication. No intermediary. A landlord who was actually reachable by phone. By April of the year before the eviction notice, I understood it differently. Gerald Marsh was personally reachable because Gerald Marsh liked to manage things personally. Not in the service of the tenants, but in the service of his own preferences and his own timeline and his own vision of what the building should be used for. What he wanted the building to be used for, I came to understand by April, was something more profitable than the current lease arrangements permitted. The neighborhood had changed. The particular thing that had happened to certain Cincinnati neighborhoods over the previous 5 years had happened to ours: coffee shops, renovated storefronts. A new restaurant that had been reviewed in a publication caused people to drive from other parts of the city. Property values are going up. Rental market tightening. The familiar pattern of a neighborhood becoming more valuable in ways that benefited owners and complicated things for existing tenants. Gerald had figured out the math. What he had not yet figured out was how to get there from here while his current tenants had valid leases. What he had figured out, apparently, was that pressure could accomplish what legal process could not. It started in April with small things. A maintenance request for a leaking kitchen faucet that went unaddressed for 3 weeks and then was addressed by a repair that failed within 10 days and then went unaddressed for another 2 weeks. I documented each request in writing through the tenant portal Gerald used and followed up by phone when responses were slow. Gerald answered my calls directly. He was always pleasant on the phone, apologetic about delays, full of explanations that were reasonable sounding individually and that accumulated into a pattern over weeks. I started recording the calls in April, not because I had clear evidence of anything yet, because I had a feeling, and my mother had always said that feelings about documentation arrived before evidence did, and should be trusted. Cincinnati is a one-party consent state. I had verified that before I started recording. One party to a conversation consenting to the recording is sufficient. I was at a party. I consented. The recordings were legal. I noted this in a small notebook I kept specifically for the Clement Street situation. Date. Call or in person. Summary of content. Recording reference number. My mother had taught me that system. In May, Gerald suggested, pleasantly and indirectly, that he was thinking about significant renovations to the building that might affect current tenants. He mentioned it in the context of a conversation about a separate maintenance issue and moved past it quickly enough that someone not paying close attention might have filed it under general information rather than deliberate communication. I filed it under deliberate communication. I noted it in the notebook. In June, Gerald mentioned for the first time that he had been thinking about the lease renewal. My lease was due for renewal in December. Gerald said he wanted to discuss terms when things settled down, and he said it in the way people say things when what they mean is something different from what they are saying. I said I looked forward to the discussion. I noted it in the notebook. In July, Gerald raised the rent verbally in a conversation that had begun about a broken hallway light and arrived at lease renewal through a series of transitions that were smooth enough to be practiced. He mentioned a figure that was 40% above my current rent. He said the market had moved significantly, and he needed to reflect that in the building's revenue. 40%. For an apartment I had lived in without incident for a year at that point, and maintained carefully and paid for consistently and on time. I said I would need to think about it. I recorded the conversation. In August, Gerald made his first direct suggestion that I might want to consider other options. He said it kindly. He said the building was going to be going through changes, and he wanted to be transparent with me as a valued tenant. He said some people found transitions like this a good opportunity to reassess their living situation. I said I appreciated the transparency. I recorded the conversation. In September, Gerald mentioned a prospective tenant who was very interested in my unit. He mentioned it as casual information. He mentioned it twice. I noted both mentions in the notebook. In October, the eviction notice appeared on my door. My attorney's name was Sandra Osei. She was 35 and had been practicing tenant rights law in Cincinnati for 8 years and had the particular focused energy of someone who had chosen her specialty because the work mattered and who had not become cynical about that choice, despite sufficient exposure to the ways people in positions of power treated people in positions of less power. I had found her through the legal aid organization my mother had worked for before becoming a coordinator. Not as a legal aid case, as a private client. I had called Sandra in August when Gerald's pressure had become consistent enough that I wanted professional counsel available before I needed it urgently. She answered my call on the Wednesday morning of the eviction notice within 20 minutes of my message. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting the way good attorneys listen when they are building a picture rather than responding to pieces of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said 41 recordings. 41, I said. Labeled by date. Backed up to cloud storage. Another pause. "Priya," she said. "How long have you been preparing for this?" "Since April," I said. When the maintenance delay started feeling like a pattern rather than an inconvenience. And the bank statements showing rent payment. 19 months of them. All payments cleared. All within the first 3 days of the month. Sandra was quiet again. "The eviction notice cites 3 months of non-payment," I said. "That did not occur." "No," Sandra said. "It did not." I could hear her making notes. "This is a retaliatory eviction. The false claim is almost certainly intended to create enough legal complexity to pressure you into leaving voluntarily." "I thought so," I said. "Most tenants don't have what you have," Sandra said. "I know. Most landlords count on that." "I know that too." Sandra said she would file a response to the eviction notice that day and request a hearing. She said the bank statements would be the foundation of the response, and the recordings would be the context that demonstrated the pattern of pressure. She also said something that stayed with me. She said, Gerald Marsh made one significant miscalculation. I waited. He assumed you were a typical tenant, she said. Someone who would be frightened by the notice, uncertain about their rights, and unwilling to navigate the legal process. He was wrong about all of those things, I said. Yes, Sandra said. He was. The hearing was scheduled for November. The 6 weeks between the eviction notice and the hearing were not easy. Not because I was uncertain about the outcome. Because living in a space while in active legal dispute with the person who owns it requires a particular kind of steadiness that has to be consciously maintained. Gerald stopped being pleasant. Not dramatically. Subtly. The small signs of a landlord who has moved from pressure to something cooler. Maintenance requests acknowledged but not addressed. A parking situation that resolved itself only after 2 written requests. A building entry code that changed without notification and required me to contact Gerald directly to receive the new one. All of it documented. All of it noted. Sandra was meticulous in her preparation. She requested Gerald's rent payment records through the legal process. She prepared a timeline of the maintenance delays, the verbal conversations about rent increases, and the suggestions that I consider other living options. She organized the 41 recordings chronologically and prepared summaries of the most relevant content. We met twice before the hearing. In our second meeting, Sandra laid out the full picture of what the documentation showed. 19 months of on-time rent payments, a 6-month pattern of pressure beginning with maintenance neglect and escalating through verbal suggestions to the false eviction notice. Recordings that documented each stage of the pressure campaign in Gerald's own voice. He is going to claim the recordings are inadmissible, Sandra said. Are they? No. Ohio is a one-party consent state. They are entirely admissible. She paused. He may not know that. Or he may be hoping I don't know it, I said. Sandra nodded once. That would be consistent with the rest of his approach. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in November. A small courtroom. A magistrate named Judge Patricia Wells, who had the particular patient authority of someone who had presided over enough housing disputes to have seen every variation of the same situations, and who was not going to be moved by anything other than documentation. Gerald was present with his own attorney. A man named Douglas Fitch, who wore an expensive suit and had the practiced ease of someone who handled landlord-tenant disputes regularly and had developed a formula for them. I sat beside Sandra at the respondent's table. Gerald looked at me once when he came in. I looked back without expression. He looked away first. Fitch opened with the non-payment claim. He presented Gerald's rent ledger, which showed 3 months of unpaid rent. Sandra responded with my bank statements. 19 months of cleared payments. Timestamps. Reference numbers. Fitch argued that the bank statements showed transfers that may not have been received. Sandra produced the confirmation emails from the tenant portal for each payment. Every single one. The portal generated an automatic confirmation when payments were received. 19 months of confirmations. Judge Wells looked at the documentation for a long moment. Then she asked Fitch a direct question about the discrepancy between the landlord's ledger and the tenant portal's confirmation records. Fitch said there may have been a technical error in the portal system. Judge Wells made a note. Sandra then introduced the pattern of pressure. She presented the maintenance request timeline. She presented the documented verbal conversations about rent increases. She presented Gerald's suggestions in August that I consider other living options. Fitch objected to the characterization of those conversations as pressure. Sandra said she had recordings. Fitch said the recordings were inadmissible. Sandra cited Ohio's one-party consent statute. She had the citation prepared and handed it to Judge Wells directly. Judge Wells read it. She looked at Fitch. Fitch said he would need to consult with his client. Judge Wells said she would hear the recordings. Sandra played 4 of the 41 recordings. The April call about the maintenance delays. The July conversation where Gerald raised the 40% rent increase. The August conversation where he suggested I consider other options. A September call where he mentioned the prospective tenant interested in my unit twice in 4 minutes. The courtroom was quiet during the recordings. Gerald sat very still. His attorney sat very still beside him. Judge Wells listened with her hands folded on the bench and made notes at 2 points during the playback. When the recordings finished, she looked at Gerald directly. She asked him whether the voice on the recordings was his. His attorney started to respond. She asked Gerald directly, not his attorney. Gerald. Gerald said yes. Judge Wells made another note. She took a 15-minute recess. When she returned, she dismissed the eviction notice. She found it to be without a factual basis. Given the documentation of payment and inconsistent with the recording evidence, given the pattern of pressure it revealed. She also did something I had not fully anticipated. She referred the matter to the city's Housing Enforcement Office for review of potential retaliatory eviction practices. That referral was not something Sandra and I had specifically requested.
Judge Wells made it on her own determination based on the evidence presented. Gerald's attorney immediately began a quiet, urgent conversation with his client. I sat at the respondent's table and looked at Sandra. She gave me the smallest nod. That was enough. We walked out of the courthouse into a cold November morning. Cincinnati in November has a specific quality of gray that is not unpleasant once you accept it as the season's honest character. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed in the cold air and felt the particular clean feeling of a morning when something that has been wrong has been correctly addressed. Sandra stood beside me. You did everything right, she said. My mother taught me the system, I said. Tell your mother she raised a very prepared daughter. I smiled. What happens now? I asked. Sandra explained the next steps. The housing enforcement review would likely result in a formal notice to Gerald about his practices. That notice would go on record. If he attempted similar actions with other tenants, it would become part of a documented pattern. My lease was valid through December, and I had every right to renewal on the existing terms if I chose to exercise it. She said that last part carefully because she understood the practical reality of living in a building owned by a man who had just had an eviction attempt dismissed and a referral filed against him. Do I want to stay? I said. That's your decision, Sandra said. You have the legal right to. Whether you want to is a different question. I thought about the apartment. The good light. The kitchen is large enough to cook in. Mrs. Okafor, who lives downstairs, leaves the newspaper on the landing every morning. I thought about Gerald Marsh and what it would mean to continue living in a space he owned and managed after everything that had just happened. I'll think about it, I said. Sandra nodded. Whatever you decide, she said. You're in a position of information rather than pressure. That's exactly where you should be. She was right. Information rather than pressure. That had been the whole strategy since April. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the second ring the way she always answered when she knew I had something to tell her. Tell me, she said. I told her. She listened through the whole account without interrupting, which was her characteristic quality, and the one I valued most. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the folder system worked. The folder system worked. I agreed. She laughed. The warm, specific laugh of someone whose practical advice has been vindicated. And the recordings. 4 of them. In open court. Your grandmother kept recordings of her property disputes on cassette tapes in the 90s, my mother said. I always thought that was excessive. It wasn't excessive, I said. No, she agreed. It was not. We talked for an hour, not about Gerald or the hearing or what came next, about other things. About my work, her work, and a trip she was planning in the spring, and a book she had been reading. Ordinary things. The particular comfort of ordinary things after an extraordinary morning. Before she hung up, she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, Priya, most people in your situation would have either left quietly or fought emotionally. You did neither. What did I do? I asked. You documented, she said. And then you waited for the documentation to speak. That was exactly right. I decided to stay in the apartment. Not from stubbornness. From the practical assessment that the apartment met my needs, the legal situation had been resolved in my favor, and leaving would have meant allowing Gerald's pressure campaign to succeed after it had already failed legally. I also knew something Gerald did not know about yet. 2 weeks after the hearing, Sandra called to tell me that the Housing Enforcement Review had found Gerald's practices with my unit to be consistent with a pattern of behavior that had also been reported by 2 previous tenants in the building. Those tenants had left. One had left quietly because she didn't know her rights. One had fought back briefly and then given up because she didn't have documentation. Gerald had assumed I would be the 3rd variation of the same story. I was not. The enforcement office issued a formal warning. Gerald's practices were documented. Any further pressure on current tenants would accelerate the review into formal proceedings. Gerald sent me a maintenance request acknowledgement for the kitchen faucet repair within 48 hours of the enforcement notice. First time that the faucet had worked properly in 6 months, I noted in my notebook. Not sarcastically. Simply accurately. The notebook was a record of events. That was one. Mrs. Okafor knocked on my door on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after the hearing. She was 71, a retired school teacher from Lagos who had lived in the building for 11 years and who was the kind of neighbor who made a building feel like something more than a collection of separate lives occupying adjacent spaces. She had brought jollof rice in a container that smelled extraordinary. I heard what happened, she said when I opened the door. Word travels, I said. In this building, it does. She handed me the container. You did a good thing. I protected my own interests, I said. Yes, she said. And in doing that, you made it harder for him to do this to the next person. She looked at me with the particular directness of someone who has seen enough of the world to know the difference between self-interest and service and does not find them mutually exclusive. That matters. I thought about the two previous tenants. The one who left quietly. The one who fought without documentation and gave up. I know, I said. Mrs. Okafor nodded once. Then she told me that jollof rice needed to be eaten warm and that I should not let it sit, and that she had also brought a small container of fried plantains because she believed plantains improved every situation. She was correct about the plantains. She was correct about most things. I am 27 years old, and I live on Clement Street in Cincinnati, Ohio, in an apartment with good light and a kitchen large enough to cook in. The faucet works. The maintenance requests are being addressed. Gerald Marsh has not spoken to me directly since the hearing. This suits both of us. I continue to document every interaction with the building and its management. Not obsessively, systematically. The folder system in the drawer beside the refrigerator, the notebook for calls and in-person conversations, the cloud backup for anything recorded. My mother would consider this the minimum reasonable standard. I've come to agree with her. Sandra Osei sent me a note in December. A brief one. She said the Housing Enforcement Office had received 2 additional complaints about Gerald's building from tenants in other units. Both complaints had referenced the October hearing as the reason they felt confident coming forward. I sat with that for a long time, not with pride exactly, with the particular weight of understanding that the thing you do to protect yourself sometimes creates cover for other people to protect themselves too. That acting on your own behalf in a specific and documented way can produce effects that extend beyond your own situation into a building, a neighborhood, a pattern of practice that affects people you have never met. I did not set out to do something significant. I set out to keep my apartment. The documentation I kept for my own protection became evidence that helped other people too. That is usually how these things work when they work at all. You do the right thing in the specific situation in front of you. You do it carefully and honestly, and without exaggerating what you have or overstating what it means. And sometimes it turns out that the careful, honest, specific thing you did has wider effects than you knew it would when you were doing it. My mother taught me to keep records. Her mother taught her. That is not a small inheritance. There is something I want to say to anyone who is in a situation where someone with power over their living situation is using that power improperly. You have more rights than they want you to know about. Document everything, every conversation, every request, every response, and every non-response.
Keep records in writing and back them up. And learn your state's laws about recording conversations, because the information is freely available and because knowledge of your rights is the first and most important protection you have.
Do not be frightened into decisions that serve someone else's interests at the cost of your own. The law exists to protect tenants from exactly the kind of pressure Gerald Marsh applied, but the law requires evidence, and evidence requires documentation. And documentation requires the habit of treating your own situation as worth recording accurately from the beginning, rather than scrambling to reconstruct it after the fact. Start the notebook before you need it. Keep the folder before the pressure begins. Record the conversation before you know what it will contain. That is not paranoia. That is preparation. And preparation, as my mother always said, is the only form of protection that arrives before the thing you need protection from. I kept my apartment. I kept my apartment. I kept both. If you are in a situation right now where something feels wrong, and you are not sure whether to trust that feeling, I hope this story gives you permission to start the notebook. Start it today. You may not always need it, but you cannot go back and start it after you already did. Thank you for being here today. If this story meant something to you, and if it finds someone who needed the reminder, please pass it on.